Hi, this is Nancy Chanteau, and I'm here live with you today. It's 2:35 on Friday, the 28th of September, and I wanted to talk to you today about Skills for Change and its lineage, its history, and what it is. What's the theory behind Skills for Change? Skills for Change was founded by Julia Kelleher. Julia has been doing coaching in Nevada City and Nevada County for 25 years now. She started doing some coaching work when she was the owner of a store called the Herb Shop. It was a combination coffee and gathering place and sales place. So her world was about managing a store, retail outlet, being there for customers every day, and having employees, and paying rent, and doing all the things that a small business owner does. And she was fascinated. She'd done a lot of work on her own around personal development work and getting body work and learning. And she'd been studying, and she started studying with Beth Roy and offering sessions. Beth Roy is a radical therapist in the Bay Area, and Julia found Beth through meeting Glenn Smith, who is one of the co-writers of our book. I'll show you a copy. Access to Power, A Radical Approach for Changing Your Life. So Julia is the primary writer, and then Glenn is one of our co-authors. And they were in a romantic relationship, and they were going and getting couples work with Beth. And Julia realized that she wanted to study. And so she embarked on her study of radical therapy. This was after having encountered Buddhism through Goenka and somatics through Lomi School. Studying with Robert Hall and Richard Strozzi Heckler. And I'll go back and talk about each of these arms of the lineage later. Right now, this is more the history. So Julia started a group after doing her study with Beth Roy. And she and Glenn co-led a group for a little while, and then she did solo groups. And I believe after that started doing one-on-one work as well. And I don't know exactly what the sequence was from co-leading groups to solo groups to doing one-on-one work. She eventually sold the Herb Shop and started a full-time practice in Nevada City, California. And Skills for Change, as she practices it, is a combination of body work, mediation, which is working with more than one person, often a couple, family, coworkers, friends, things like that, to solve conflict problems in relations. And she always had groups as well. She had women's groups. She's still running 2 women's groups. And one-on-one work. So body work, mediations, groups, and one-on-one coaching work is those are the 4 major elements of Skills for Change. In addition, Julia has often over the course of the 25 years taught people how to do Skills for Change as well. So that's her practice. In 2004, I came up to Nevada County and started working with her in December. And my experience of Skills for Change, I came in to start working on my shame, but I had just gotten laid off. So I ended up talking to her about whether or not I was going to start a coaching practice. And on my second session in her practice, she invited me into a training group. So during the first year of studying Skills for Change with Julia as a one-on-one client, I also became a student in a small group. And I learned Skills for Change over the course we would meet for 3 hours every 3 weeks. And at the end of the year, we completed that process. And it was pretty much, I think our first meeting was either end of January or early February of 2005. So we worked throughout I think there was a period of time where we took a small break, but we worked pretty steadily through 2005. Doing those 3 hour sessions every 3 weeks. So let me break Skills for Change down into the categories, and then I'll talk more about my practice of Skills for Change and my own lineage. So radical therapy obviously is a key element, a key base for Skills for Change. Beth was a member of the Radical Therapy Collective, and radical therapy is an approach to working with power in relationships in our personal lives. The Radical Therapy Collective was involved in the mental health arm of the Berkeley Free Clinic, and the group ended up writing a book together, Radical Therapy: The Second Decade. Beth Roy and Claude Steiners were the editors, and the documents or the essays in that book are all about power and oppression, internalized oppression, how we are able to learn about, for example, the rescue dynamic, and how understanding a transaction helps us understand power and things that we can do to change that, to change how we do those kinds of transactions, the way that we can cooperate by clearing held feelings, sharing our stories and negotiating, sharing paranoias, the practice of running a group. All of these topics are covered in Radical Therapy: The Second Decade. Beth still sells hand-bound copies of that book, and I occasionally have them to sell. Right now I'm down to, I think, my last one. But the book is also, Radical Therapy: The Second Decade is also available for download on the internet. Claude Steiners had it on his website, and I believe that Beth Roy has it on her website. Claude passed away at the beginning of, I want to say this year, but it could actually be last year, 2016. I think it was beginning of 2017, actually. So he's no longer with us, and I don't know how long his website will be maintained. So radical therapy is this huge contribution to Skills for Change. It has as its base a materialist Marxist orientation and an orientation towards transactions, that we're analyzing power in transactions. And by analyzing power in transactions, we are able to make more choices about how we interact, how we relate with each other, do something to rebalance power. I learned not too long ago that Beth Roy's analysis of power, she has a wonderful chapter in the book Recentering that she also edited, where she talks about types of power, talks about systemic or structural power, cultural power, organizational positional power, contractual power, personal power, and transactional power. And that model, we also included in our book. Julia wrote a chapter on power and access to power. That model turns out to let us take an analysis of a transaction and get very specific about how power is impacting each of the people involved in a transaction as well as the transaction itself, which is why transactional power is identified as a separate source of power, because our ability to make a transaction go a certain way is a reflection of all of the types of power combined into the moment, into the context. So we're taking the context into account in analyzing the power in a transaction. So very often, if a transaction is happening between somebody who is systemically and historically oppressed and somebody who is systemically and historically privileged, that transaction might seem like it would automatically go in favor of the person who has the privilege and the structural power. And because transactional power is actually so contextual, if somebody takes a lot of time and energy and also has the education and support and privilege, and privilege that they may not have examined, to empower themselves to really leverage their personal and transactional power, they may actually have more transactional power than the person with all the systemic, structural, historic privilege, because of the way in which people who are oppressed have struggled. That in a transaction, they may actually be vastly more powerful than the person with the privilege. That doesn't mean that the analysis automatically means that the person who's oppressed then should give up their power. It just means that we're seeing all of the power that's working in the transaction instead of witnessing only the historical or cultural elements. The lens that we look at power through affects the power we see or the power we witness. And so what analysis we have affects our ability to analyze a transaction. And I learned that without Beth's transactional analysis, without her theory, I was meeting radical therapists and emotional literacy practitioners and transactional analysts. I met them at a meeting at Claude Steiners' house in Round Mountain in Ukiah in the summer of 2016. And I discovered that we analyze power really differently. And a lot of that had to do with the fact that in Skills for Change, we've really taken in that power analysis, that power theory, and applied it to transactions and applied it to how people interact. And that sophistication and nuance, without that theory, people don't witness the power the way that people who have been trained in Skills for Change witness it. So it ended up creating quite a schism that I didn't really understand until I left the meeting. Because how I was witnessing power, I was assuming that everybody at that meeting was going to understand power in the same way, and there was nobody in the room who understood power the way I understood it. So I find that incredibly fascinating about Skills for Change, and it's one of the things I'd like to do in the next year is to create a class about how to do that power analysis. I'm planning on calling it Power, Inequality, and Injustice in Transactions. So, and creating a whole grid for how we can look at all of the different sources of power per person, and then how that comes together in the transaction. So that I can, in the alienation formula from Marx, the alienation formula says alienation equals isolation plus oppression plus mystification. And it's talking about Marx was writing this theory, this alienation formula in relation to the alienation of labor, the way that the guild masters became alienated from their labor as the Industrial Revolution created the factory and the way that unskilled labor could become part of making a shoe, and somebody could sit there and hammer nails into the heel of a shoe all day and not know how to make a shoe. Whereas when somebody would enter into a guild, become apprentice, and then a journeyman, and then a master at their craft, they would have control over the entire shoemaking process, and they would be responsible for the output, the labor that they put into the shoe. They would have a relationship with the object of their labor, and that relationship was empowering. And when people became alienated from the object of the labor that they were working, when they became unskilled laborers working on a factory line, an assembly line, that their skill, they could be easily replaced, and they were not empowered by having done the single role on the assembly line, that they would have been empowered if they had made the whole shoe. So the antidote to the alienation formula is and Julia talks about this in the book as an empowerment formula, that we are thinking about knowledge as an antidote to mystification, and community as an antidote to isolation, and action against oppression as an antidote to oppression. That this way that we can individually, personally empower ourselves, that this is a formula for that. And I've recently been having a chat with her about the liberation formula. Like, if we were to think about collective liberation instead of individual empowerment, if we were thinking about liberation, that we would be thinking about contact within community, any kind of contact as an antidote to isolation, action against oppression, and access to the truth. So it's not just access to knowledge, but access to an understandable truth. And we can see in all of this fake news how lack of access to the truth, how alienating that is. So deeply, radical therapy is based on antidoting the alienation formula on a personal basis. Radical therapy was named radical therapy because they were looking at how therapeutic relationships in the 60s, 70s, and 80s really reproduced an oppressive dynamic. The therapist was considered to be the person who had all of the authority, that they had the authority to diagnose, that the patient was crazy or in some way disturbed or neurotic, and that neuroses was something that the therapist understood, but the patient couldn't. And so there's this one up, one down relationship that's inherently primed for power abuse. And we're in radical therapy was directly challenging that, saying that the diagnoses that often were getting applied to patients of therapists were not reflective of that power dynamic, and that if we took power into account, oftentimes helping people change their power would often make their neurotic behavior go away. And so then the diagnosis isn't accurate because the problem wasn't a mysterious and ununderstandable disease that only therapists understand. It was actually something that the people on the couch who were receiving the care could understand and might even be necessary in order to do something about, in order to name the power problem and do something about it. Therapy clients in radical therapy in Skills for Change are responsible for the work that we do. We don't think of ourselves as doing work on people. We think about doing work with people. And we do that within the language we use is the language of a contract. We make a contract with clients. Clients tell us what they want to accomplish, and then the radical therapist or the Skills for Change practitioner agrees to do that contract, renegotiates that contract, and then we work on that contract together. That the client is in charge rather than the therapist, and that I really like to think of this as in alignment with pedagogy of the oppressed, that Paulo Freire's work pointed us in this direction, that the privileged can't come up with an anti-oppression learning process for oppressed people. Oppressed people have to tell privileged people what they need, and then privileged people can say what they're willing and able to do. But the pedagogy, the agenda, the learning is designed and led by the oppressed person and not by the privileged person. And I very much, in Skills for Change, we very much operate based on that. So we're looking at identifying how to empower clients and how from their power they can start to ask for what they need and want and embark on a learning process to get that. So we've got this basic underlying framework of anti-alienation or liberation or empowerment, combined with a reseating of the power out of the therapist chair and into the client's chair, so that the client is the person with the power in the relationship and gets to decide what the direction is and what they're doing, and the therapist is a guide and a person who responds rather than a person who is in charge and directing the activity. So there's a really big difference in how we negotiate power throughout the entire relationship based on that, starting with the contract, and in every session we negotiate the agenda so that the person who's receiving the work gets to say how it goes. Radical therapy is deeply politicized, power informed. The personal is political. We pay attention to and listen to oppression. We commit to siding with underdogs in social structures and in environments where people are oppressed. And using our voice and our power to help address imbalances of power. So that's a big difference between the way that often therapeutic work or coaching is conducted. That instead of being in a situation where we're the all-knowing provider and we tell people what they need to do, we invite them to tell us what they want, and then we work to create a path towards that destination that will hopefully get people there and empower them along the way. So in addition, part of the reason that Julia didn't just hang a shingle as a radical therapist is that she had been studying Buddhism with Goenka, and also somatics. She was a Lomi School. She's a Lomi School graduate. Lomi School was founded by Robert Hall and Richard Strozzi Heckler, and was primarily a training program for folks to become body workers, Lomi School body workers. And Richard and Robert, I believe Robert studied directly with Ida Rolf. Richard was able to observe Moshe Feldenkrais his first year here teaching in offering sessions in the United States. And both of them were deep students of Randolph Stone, the founder of polarity therapy. And Randolph Stone wanted Richard and Robert to take on polarity therapy when he was retiring, and they didn't want to do that. So they created Lomi therapy to bring these modalities together. I learned somatic bodywork from Richard Strozzi Heckler at Strozzi Institute. So my understanding of the approach, I was never in a Lomi School class, so I can't speak to what exactly they were teaching in Lomi School. I know from having studied somatic bodywork with Richard that our approach to bodywork is that people store armoring, and that's Wilhelm Reich's word, armoring in the body. We store our survival strategies and our history in our bodies, in our tissue, and bodywork can help us release that. And in order to do that, it's not just a process of working on the body. It's a process of working with the client with the body and also through the body to work with the self, because our shaping, the way that we hold our bodies, the way that we hold ourselves, is fundamentally relating to our profound feelings of safety and connection, and our ability to access safety and connection. And the armoring that comes into our body that stops the flow of energy in our body, usually armoring is a horizontal band, and it stops the vertical flow of energy in the body. That our horizontal armoring, you can see it. It's, the forehead, the eyes, even in the sinus, the jaw, then throat, the shoulders, the chest, armoring bands all the way down the body, stopping us from doing things. When we're children and we cry and an adult says, don't cry, we try and organize ourselves to stop crying, to be good, to be loved, to get what we need, to be supported. So, the armoring is something that we no longer need to put our conscious intention on in order to shape ourselves that way. It becomes embodied through practice and through intensity. And we're much more likely to release it when we are doing that consciously as selves, that our self is engaged in the process of doing the releasing, that it's not just something being done to us, but it's something that we are participating in. And so it's often something done with eyes open or conscious. We might be having a conversation. There might be eyes closed and having a conversation, but there's awareness and engagement instead of this feeling of like passively going to sleep in the session. And that orientation Richard brought to his creation of somatic coaching at Strozzi Institute. I am a certified master somatic coach through Strozzi Institute, and Julia got her Lomi School certificate through Lomi School. So when I came up and studied with Julia, I was bringing all of my understanding of somatic coaching to my learning skills for change. So key elements of Richard and Robert's approach to somatics that influenced Julia would be this idea of armoring, the idea of working through the body to work with the self, the idea that we embody things through practice, and that if we want to change, we need to practice, and that change takes time because of embodiment. That it's not something, sometimes we've practiced enough and we get an idea and we're able to just instantly change, but the readiness was there. We'd already done the practices that it took in order to make that change, and it just seems like it was instantaneous. Other times, a new idea will come along and we have no preparation and we have to actually do all of the practice to get to embody something. Richard Schmidt, in a book on behavioral change, talked about how it takes 300 repetitions to get something into muscle memory on average, and 3,000 repetitions to change from one thing to another. So most of us, when we're trying to change something, aren't planning. We might plan for a 300 repetition process. We're probably not planning for a 3,000 repetition process, which explains a lot of why people might feel burnt out and exhausted around change, how we can get heartbroken around change. I wrote a sidebar in Access to Power about this. I called it Dropping Out of Change. How when we're going along the change process, at the beginning we can be very excited. We're doing a new thing and we've never done it before, and we're doing it more and more and more. It's so exciting. And then as we get to 30, 40%, 50% of the time that we're able to do it, we start focusing on the fact that we're not doing it 70%, 60%, 50% of the time. And that not doing it becomes more important than the doing it that we were so excited about before. And we can, even though we're still making progress in our practice, even though, we were 30% last week and now we're 40%, and next week, if we keep going, we'll be at 50%, it can start to feel like we're going backwards instead of going forwards, even though that's the opposite of what's happening. Because our awareness of all of the times that we're not doing something is acute and crystal clear at that point. When we're trying to make a change, very often we have to bring our awareness to the moment of change in order to make that change. And the moment, our awareness will increase ahead of our capacity to do a practice. So at some point, we have 100% awareness of ourselves, but not 100% capacity to change our practice yet. And that can be very disheartening. So we really need to support ourselves in the middle. And when we're practicing in the middle, as we get to 30% of the time, 40% of the time, 50% of the time we're doing the practice, that period is actually a very important time to have accountability and support and encouragement, and to not be hard on ourselves for all the ways in which we're not doing what we want to be doing. Because if we stay practicing, pretty soon we'll get to 60, 65, 70, 75%, and it will feel like, oh, I'm doing this most of the time. I'm not doing that old practice very much at all anymore. And then usually it's downhill after that. We're able to get to the full embodiment. So I see people dropping out of change over and over and over again, where they'll drop out they're making progress still, but they'll drop out because it doesn't feel like they're getting where they want to go, because they're all of a sudden aware of all of the times they're not doing what they want. So this principle of practice is central also to Skills for Change, to somatic coaching. So I named Ida Rolf, Moshe Feldenkrais, and Randolph Stone for body work. Embodiment-wise, Richard is a 7th degree, and maybe he's more now, black belt in Aikido. Aikido is a nonviolent martial art from Japan. And Richard was also studying with Fernando Flores, who is a Chilean. he's a linguist, and he was talking about speech acts in business and how, for example, in order to get business to happen, we need to have certain kinds of conversations. And Richard took Fernando Flores's work on speech acts, requests, declines, declarations, insists, quits, and he put it together with Aikido and made a somatic embodied approach to these speech acts. Not only standing moving practice, but also using a jo, which is a stick weapon from Aikido, so that we could notice ourselves practicing making a request or making a decline, and notice what happens when the body is doing something content-free. We're just practicing making a request, and our body is doing something. And that noticing lets us see, when out of context, what we do just approaching the request itself. And then we could also add the context and notice what we do with the base of the request plus the context. So we might make a powerful request without context. As you add the context, the body might collapse in some way. And then we could practice bringing something other than collapse to that transaction and change how we engage in that request. And eventually change how we engage in that request within its actual context. So it would, somatics, bringing Aikido together with the speech act work, Fernando Flores's speech act work, really allowed us to analyze a specific transaction, figure out what was going on, and then practice the changes that we wanted to make, which is huge. So combining an embodied approach that takes practice into account in a theory of change, plus a radical analysis of power and oppression and how power affects transactions. This is the combination that makes Skills for Change so special. And I know I've left some of the lineage out, so I'm just going to look at my notes for a second. So I mentioned also Wilhelm Reich, his very important thinker for the somatics world. He was a contemporary of Freud's. He was noticing that the talking cure didn't work for everyone. And so he really focused on the body. He ended up dying in jail because he focused on the energy of orgasm and the healing power of the energy of orgasm, and created a machine called the Orgone machine and was selling it through the mail. And he ended up dying in jail of a mail fraud charge. So, he wasn't popular, and he was considered to be pretty threatening to the establishment, talking about sexuality and the failure of the talking cure. This is also in the context of Freud, as Judith Butler talks about in Trauma and Recovery. I'm sorry, it's not Judith Butler, it's Judith Herman. In Trauma and Recovery, she talks about how Freud came up, when he was first studying women who were hysterical, he came to the conclusion that they were survivors of sexual abuse, and was basically threatened with expulsion from the major psychology communities if he didn't recant and come up with different theories. And that's where we get penis envy and all of these other theories that he came up with later, was post his recanting of the idea that why everybody was so disturbed was based on the fact that they were survivors of childhood sexual abuse. So, because if you have that many survivors, you have that many perpetrators. And that was a very threatening idea for our culture, and still is a very threatening idea for our culture. Okay, so we have some history of how Julia got into Skills for Change, and how she created Skills for Change. Beth Roy was her teacher of radical therapy, and really encouraged Julia to bring her somatics work together with radical therapy, and not call what she was doing radical therapy anymore. Beth has always really supported Julia's work and is alive in San Francisco, writing books and teaching and mediating and coaching. So if you're interested, all of these people are still alive. Beth Roy in San Francisco, Julia Kelleher in Nevada City, and Richard Strozzi Heckler in Petaluma, California, and then Robert Hall is down in Baja California, and I think he mostly leads meditation retreats now, but I'm not exactly sure. I'm not in touch with him and his work. So, and the one other person in the lineage that I really wanted to speak to is Eric Bern in Transactional Analysis. I believe that Transactional Analysis and Eric Bern's work was brought to the Radical Therapy Collective via Claude Steiner. Claude would go to Eric's house along with Marshall Rosenberg and other people like Stan. I think Stan Dale may not have gone to Eric Bern's house. He may have studied with Claude or Marshall, the founder of Human Awareness Institute. So transactional analysis has had a very large impact on the West Coast personal development and healing modalities. All of the interactive workshops that people take, a lot of them are deeply influenced by transactional analysis. In his book, Game People Play, Eric Bern, the first game in that book is the rescue game, and it's based on the alcoholics game, and it's based on the idea that when somebody is alcoholic, somebody will take on a rescuer role and try and save that person, and then get persecutorial, and then end up back into rescue again. And Stephen Cartman took that model and turned it into a triangle, and many people know of that model as the drama triangle, where we end up playing a rescuer, a victim, or a persecutor role. We go from rescuer to victim through burnout. We go to victim to persecutor through rebellion, and we go from persecutor back into rescuer through guilt. The Radical Therapy Collective really took on the rescue dynamic and called it the rescue triangle, and we're fascinated in the way it's a reflection of and use of power. Essentially, the rescue dynamic is a power play. Somebody is unilaterally choosing to do more than their share or more than they want to do to try to help somebody. That extra effort, unnegotiated, will often not be received well, and the person may or may not reject the efforts that were made on their behalf. And that doing that unilateral effort will burn us out. And then we feel like a victim when we're able to do less than our share or less than we want to do. And that often will make us feel rebellious or angry in some way, and we'll rebel and feel impatient or irritated or frustrated or angry or even enraged. And the acting out of that anger will often then make us feel guilty and take us back into doing more than our share, more than we want to do out of desperation. Like to think about rescue as being something that we're doing in situations of competition, danger, and scarcity to desperately try and fix a situation that's not working. And sometimes rescues work. Most of the time, rescues blow up on us. And the Radical Therapy Collective was defining an antidote to the power play of the rescue dynamic as being cooperation. They define cooperation either as ask for 100% of what you want 100% of the time and negotiate agreements, or no secrets, no lies, no rescues, and no power plays. So when we can ask for 100% of what we want 100% of the time, hear somebody else's 100% of what they want 100% of the time, and then negotiate agreements, we're agreeing on what we're going to do. So if we want to help somebody, we would say, I'd like to help you. I want you to receive my help. Are you willing to receive my help? In what ways would you want to receive it in order for me to help you? That whole process of negotiating that agreement very much can it creates a cooperative process where we're all working. Receiving help is work. Receiving help is something that we might want to design, especially if we think about the pedagogy of the oppressed and the idea that the privileged can't design a way out of oppression for oppressed people. Oppressed people need to design that. So if we are able to negotiate a way to help somebody that works for them, that they say, yes, I would like that, and I'm willing to do the work to receive that help and, make use of it, all of a sudden we have a different framework altogether. cooperation can be challenging to do if we don't have the spoons, if we don't, Christine Miserandrino's work around spoon theory, if we don't have the energy on a daily basis to do the extra effort of cooperating, we might not be able to cooperate. Cooperation requires that we both want to. It requires participation. And it takes a lot of time. Power plays tend to be more efficient, and cooperation tends to be very inefficient. Cooperation tends to be intimate, and power plays or hierarchy tends to be disconnected more, not very intimate. So if we want more intimacy but have the time to do it, we can cooperate. If we don't have the time to cooperate, we might end up power playing or rescuing out of desperation to try and fix something because there's no time to cooperate. So we don't want to idealize cooperation as if it's always the right thing to do and make rescue always the wrong thing to do. We want much more, and especially in situations where we're constantly dealing with systemic rescue, where the oppressive forces in our world we're constantly persecuting against those, forces. Julia Carroll called that compassionate persecutor, where we want to be compassionate for ourselves for dealing with a system that is oppressive, that we're advocating for change around. But it's a rescue to be in that system. We really want to be able to be honest with ourselves about whether or not we actually can cooperate and negotiate, if it's available, if it's a possibility, and not idealize that and demonize rescue or power plays, because sometimes power plays are necessary. We're going to do the best we can, and we're limited, and people have limited skills, and sometimes there just isn't corresponding needs that would bring us together and allow us to cooperate. So these are descriptions of how a transaction can go, and they help us understand what's happening in the transactions we're experiencing. So Claude Steiners, I believe I got this theory from The Other Side of Power, his book. He talks about the 5 responses to a power play are to give in, to fight, to negotiate, to ignore the power play, or to take collective action against the power play. So I like to take that into account, that if we're dealing with a power play situation, we might need to be using one of the other. Negotiate would be obviously a cooperation move, but the other moves of giving in or fighting, ignoring, or taking collective action, those moves might also be useful to us to know. And the definition, I think this is his definition of a power play, is making somebody do something they don't want to do, or keeping them from doing something they want to do. And I find that works really well, linking that to oppression, systemic oppression, to understand what oppression is. With oppression, you can understand that over time as something that costs people, that can be monetized. Oppression can always be monetized. Privilege can be monetized. We can put a dollar value, or put a value to somebody, to the cost to somebody of being oppressed, and we can put a value, a benefit cost, to people who are being privileged. So I define privilege as both immunity from costs and also access to unearned benefits. So privilege isn't just immunity from the costs of oppression, it's also access to unearned benefits. Oppression would be exposure to costs and lack of access to unearned benefits as well. So I think I covered all of the lineage pieces I wanted to talk about. And I also covered a lot of theory. So what I'd like to do is talk a little bit about how I got into Skills for Change in my own practice lineage. I started coaching in 2000. I started studying at Strozzi Institute in 2002. I took a class there called Professional Mastery because I was having problems in my workplace with conflict. And at the end of that class, I was not done. And so I went back for a second year. And the second year was you had to do 2 years in order to get a somatic coaching certificate at that time. And about halfway through, I want to say the second course, I committed to the coaching program, which required, I believe, 2 more courses. And so I was able to do 2 more courses over the next couple of years. I finished the Somatic Coaching program in December of 2004. I did my supervision coaching with Richard Strozzi Heckler, which was pretty amazing. Not everybody was able to do that, and I'm very honored and happy to have had that experience. Many, many powerful coaching moments through having received coaching from Richard. And I graduated from the Somatic Coaching program on a Sunday in 2004. And I had negotiated in my work at a biotech company in the Bay Area, I had negotiated a part-time telecommuting role in the last year, in 2004, in the last year of my coaching program, because I was really wanting to, I had not gotten promoted. My boss had left his position. I had gotten somebody hired over into his position instead of me. And I was not interested in going sideways to try and keep going up the corporate ladder. So I got this telecommuting part-time job, and I got laid off on the Tuesday. I completed Somatic Coaching on a Sunday, got laid off on a Tuesday, and I had my first session scheduled with Julia Kelleher on Thursday of that week. So I was supposed to go in and work on my shame. I called her up and said, "Can you help me with my shame?" And she said, "Yes, I can." And I walked in and said, "Well, we can't work on my shame. I need to talk about work." And she helped me figure out that I wanted to become a coach and design that whole process. So I walked into Nevada County and started learning skills for change as having just completed my somatic coaching training with Strozzi Institute, which was a powerful platform for me to enter into Skills for Change with. In addition, I have been an avid yoga practitioner, and in 2006, I became a yoga teacher. I taught for 10 years in Nevada County. My teachers in yoga were primarily Tim Thompson and Laura Camp in Oakland. Very influenced by the Ashtanga practice as Tim teaches it. And his teachers were Rodney Yee and Sarah Powers. He learned Ashtanga from Sarah. And I believe Sarah studied directly with Pattabhi Jois. Rodney studied directly with BKS Iyengar. And so that's the yoga lineage for my yoga training. And definitely yoga was very influential on my practice as a somatic bodyworker and also as a coach. It's hard to see the water that we're swimming in. It's hard to witness that. So I don't know who I would be. Yoga was my first exposure to any kind of embodied somatic spiritual practice. So I really encountered ideas like the idea of enlightenment, relating with my breath, being in the present moment. All of those ideas I encountered through my yoga practice. And I have no idea what it would have been like to do all of this. I mean, I don't think I would have found all of this training without doing yoga. The reason I found Strozzi Institute was that I had been practicing Aikido, and I went to Aikido because one of my yoga friends was doing it, and I wanted to spend more time with her. So I practiced Aikido for a year, and I started coming up to the time when it was time for me to be testing, and I really did not want to. I just had all this about, I do not want to test. I do not want there to be ranks. I do not want to be judged. I don't want this practice that I'm doing to have anything to do with that. And I would get on the mat and kind of burst into tears. And my Aikido sensei at the time, he was not very emotionally intelligent. And he said, "This is why I have a book list. So go read the books on the book list." And Richard's book, In Search of the Warrior Spirit, was one of the books on the list. And it's the first book that arrived. I ordered a bunch of books, and his came first, and I read it avidly and thought I would go to an Aikido class from him to see if I could figure out why I was bursting into tears. And instead, I ended up finding Strozzi Institute. So I studied somatics instead of studying Aikido with him. I dropped out I never solved that problem within the context of Aikido, but I did realize that the reason I was having trouble was that I did not want to hurt somebody for my learning. And I was at a dangerous stage in my development as a practitioner, an Aikido practitioner, where I would tend to kind of muscle and overpower. And I was afraid that I would hurt somebody and have to live with having hurt somebody to learn. And it's, amazing, wonderfully and amazingly, I learned a lot of the practice of blending that I needed to learn on the Aikido mat in the somatic coaching. I never took it back to Aikido, but I know that the skills of softening that I needed to do and not overpowering, I was able to develop those skills in a different way than on the Aikido mat. So when I launched my coaching practice, I launched it as a writing coach, helping people write books. And I offered 10 people 12 sessions for free each. So I ended up doing 120 hours for free. I started doing that in September of 2004. And I got my first check from somebody in January of 2005. I took a sabbatical between getting laid off and really launching into my coaching practice. And but 80% of those 10 folks I offered 12 sessions to turned into paid clients for me, which was wonderful. A lot of them were people I knew from Strozzi, and I'm very, very grateful for the environment that Strozzi was and how it allowed me to be successful as a coach. And I realized after doing quite a bit of writing coaching in 2005 that I was really missing the embodied aspect. So I went back and took a bodywork class and reminded people that I was a bodyworker as well. And that led me really squarely into working one-on-one with people in a coaching capacity. And I did that, a mix of coaching, supervision, and bodywork, and life coaching essentially, and writing coaching until I think it was 2009 when I decided I wanted to teach skills for change coaching to people. I wanted to start certifying coaches. And Julia told me that if I did not start mediating clients, if I didn't work with more than one person in that way, that she wouldn't support me to certify coaches. So I launched my mediation practice at that point, somewhat reluctantly, and started teaching skills for change coaching skills in 2010. I started with the bodywork course, and then I did a coaching course and a mediation course. Finally, it was the last course I taught. And I actually brought in Julia Kelleher and Julia Carroll to help me teach that course so that I just didn't feel as grounded in that practice. But you do enough mediation and it gets into you. So I have a skilled mediator now as well. So those are my elements, the things that I brought with me to becoming those. Plus I worked in several different business contexts in my work life. I did about 10 years starting out as an administrative assistant, and then I got myself into IT. I did some help desk work and some computer troubleshooting work. And then I ended up becoming a systems analyst and eventually became manager of sales operations at a biotech company. And absolutely, my business experience is also one of the things that I bring to my coaching skills. So I feel like in Skills for Change, Julia being a small business owner, me having those years of business experience, one of the things that you can really count on from Skills for Change is a very pragmatic approach. We're interested in figuring out what's happening right now. What are you doing? What's happening in your life? What do you like about it? What don't you like about it? What do you want to be different? And how can you practice that change? And doing all of the work that it takes in order to make that change happen, including an understanding of how do we observe ourselves? What is the consciousness process? How do we locate ourselves? Eric Bern created a model called, the founder of Transactional Analysis, called the Parent-Adult-Child model. And the culture took the inner child from that model and didn't take anything else. Radical therapy took the parent and talked about it, named it as the pig parent, and talked about how that's a function, that's how we internalize oppression, is that we have this voice in our head, this sense of cops in our head, as Augusto Boal, the founder of Theater of the Oppressed, calls it. We have this internal sense of a judge or a cop or a authority figure. And that the pig parent is, they called it pig to remind us of the police aspect, that cops on the street in the 60s were called pigs, that we would have this internal cop in our heads that was trying to tell us how to be good and how to be right and how to not be wrong and how to not be bad. And it's very dualistic. So it's good or bad, right or wrong, rather than good and bad, right and wrong. But I say, for what we're trying to get to, wise adult consciousness, we're trying to get to non-dualism, right for me, right for you, wrong for me, wrong for you, depending on the context. So we're really widening what's right and what's wrong, and being able to understand how something can be right for me and right for you at the same time. So I think I want to wrap up here. This history of Skills for Change, the lineage, the practice. I am interested, as usual, in answering questions and engaging with you. I have a Patreon page, and love to have people come and support me on that. It's patreon.com/Nancy Shanteau. I'll put a link in the comments. You can also find my website, www.nancyshanteau.com. And I want to shout out to some of my patrons. I didn't get people's permission to say their name, so I probably shouldn't do that. But I will include some shout outs in the future to the folks that have been supporting me. I reached my year anniversary with Patreon in August, and I'm running a special offer right now where if you pledge $15 a month for the next 3 months, you'll get unlimited self-paced classes on my online classes. And for $25 a month, you'll get unlimited webinar classes. So I've posted lots of videos about that. It expires September 30th, 2018. If you're watching this video much later than that, I might be running a different special offer. You should go check out my Patreon and find out what's going on over there. All right. Thanks very much for your attention and time today. I love answering questions and chatting. So if you want to reach out, please feel free. I hope this was helpful and interesting.